Welcome to SciTech Culture with Steve Kern and Ben Warner, where we examine science, technology and culture in the 21st century. Visit our website at scitechculture.com.
Hello and welcome to SciTech Culture. My name is Ben Warner and I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague Steve Kern. How are we today, Steve? Contemplating, return to some sort of normalcy, but as we were just discussing before we got on, it's complicated.
It is complicated. Look at me, I need a haircut. And, that's just for me to get back in the office. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah, and the barber's going to be using like 1.5 meter long, sticks to buzz your hair. So we're going to talk about today this whole... what would you call it? The easing of restrictions, so we can now start to do more in greater society or something like that. But of course, there's a whole list of complications that are associated with this. We can probably talk about the office stuff in a minute, but I wanted to start with what everyone was talking about in terms of cafes, pubs and restaurants. And there was an interesting ABC article where they were talking about how all of that was going to be completely different in a way going forward. The obvious one being that the takeaway business is going to go through the roof if it hasn't already, because that's really the only way people have been able to get food in a lot of instances, and what they may even be just comfortable getting as well.
For those of us who can't cook, I guess takeaway is the only option.
Exactly. But then there's now the other logistics around how many people can be in a space, how far they have to be spaced out. Even things like, restaurants may be potentially only looking at doing 10 diners at a time and then doing seating blocks. So the idea that if you were going to show up at a restaurant at 7:30 at night and then just, while away the hours, with your friends and that might not be a thing anymore, because, you got to go in and you got to go out. And also that things like menus might get restricted because they don't have the amount of patrons for turnover. So if you're serving 130 people, you can probably get away with a larger menu and be able to cook more. But if you've only can do 10 people at a time, you have to think about business-wise how much you're going to make available so there's not wastage and all that sort of thing. And it seems like just like a convoluted, diabolical problem, but there's still an attempt to try and get all this stuff up and running.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about this. They're talking about easing restrictions but putting in more regulations, and maybe we need to be controversial here, but it's mind-numbingly contradictory and confusing. So, for instance, I don't think anyone could argue that as a country, Australia, we've done a fantastic job of basically suppressing the virus. And that's come through basically stopping work, stopping businesses and people getting together through social distancing, work from home for those that have work, and even probably the government support packages to some extent. Really good job. Now we're trying to get back, and they're talking about easing restrictions, but they're not really, because they're putting in so many regulations that I don't actually see how any of this is going to work. The end point has to be, I think it would be natural for all of us to expect, is that the end point would be life going back to how it was in 2019.
Which seems so long ago at this point, doesn't it?
Don't think long ago. But the question really is, if that means that there's no more talk of social distancing and people jamming together in public transport, theatres, sporting venues, that in our minds at least is what used to happen. Will someone come out and say that's never going to happen again? Or give us a date when it might? I mean, we now have international travel as 2023.
Yeah.
If you read between the lines on that, does that mean that there's going to be social distancing until 2023?
And like, just to pick out another example, we were saying like that, and that new normal and this introduction of regulation. New Zealand, in terms of the pubs, restaurant stuff, and apparently this has been adopted in Darwin, so they've just recently opened as well, particularly for going for a beer and all that sort of thing. Rules around, you can only have people seated, they have to be separated for the social distancing, there'll only be a single server, there's everything from laminated menus that are sprayed after every touch, I guess, and it kind of like the regulation part of it aside, and how crazy all of that is to try and manage it, doesn't even that just detract from the whole experience and the point of going anyway?
Well, there's so many contradictions, aren't there? So in Australia now, we're heading into what seems like it's going to be quite a cold winter, and you're saying that a restaurant can open, but only this is in some states, it's different all the way around, but typically you want people dining outside, maximum of 10. Right. Firstly, if you can find 10 people that want to sit outside in the freezing cold to have a meal,
good luck.
Good on you. But from there, it's probably not going to make a restaurant want to open because they're not going to make any money. So the regulations in themselves aren't dumb, but nobody's testing them. I thought the other thing was interesting was they were saying that you can sit around and have a meal for 2 hours, maximum of 2 hours. Surely if you wanted to work with the restaurateurs, and probably makes sense if you're forcing people to sit outside in the middle of winter to enjoy their meal, give them 35 minutes tops. I mean, if a group of 10 sits in a restaurant for 2 hours, unless they're drinking very expensive wine, I don't think the restaurant's got any hope of making money.
Exactly. And just to pick up on that 2-hour time limit, that is something that apparently they're doing in Darwin too with pubs. But the additional thing, which is kind of counterintuitive to the whole pub experience, is that you can't stand at the counter. So you have to be seated. So again, it's just one thing after another with this sort of stuff.
But if you're seated, surely then your arms are on the table.
Yeah.
And if you're on the table, then you're spreading it all across the surface in front of you. At least at a bar, the surface area of the bar is smaller.
Well, that's where you get your studious waiting staff wiping everything down after every attendance or something, I guess.
And then what about some of the other potential conflicts which have been highlighted? Like potentially you go to a bar or a restaurant, and technically the bar or restaurant may have to ask you to download the app, otherwise they'll be liable. However, legally they can't make you download the app, and in fact would be subject to a fine for forcing you to download the app.
Yeah, but they could argue that they just deny you entry or something like that. So they're not forcing you; it's just they're giving you a choice.
Yeah, that's really going to work well for the restaurants.
And the lawyers will love that anyway.
Look, it's not to mock these things, but I think that it just shows that as a society, this COVID situation is a very serious situation, obviously. And that's why we're trying to make these rules, restrictions, regulations. But we need to not think of this as if it's a normal world and we're just saying don't park on a double line as an arbitrary thing. There needs to be a lot more nuanced interpretation. And as a nation, I think we've shown that we're pretty reasonable in terms of complying. I guess the Bondi incident excluded. But outside of that, we've done a pretty good job. So give us a bit of, an incentive as a society to do the right thing without regulation.
The interesting thing is that we're using examples now of, discretionary activities, but then this also applies where we've got office environments, people coming back into work, using public transport to get to work, that being the most diabolical one. But even things like simple things as like waiting to catch a lift to get to your floor in your office, and and you've seen in those busy buildings how many people can congregate in a ground floor lobby while they're waiting for the lift, and how that would work practically. Now, they can talk about like staggered returns to work and having bunches of people still working at home, but it's still difficult to try and manage that.
Well, look, this is no different to sporting venues. Even if you take 80% of the attendance out, so at the MCG, that would allow 20,000 people there, I guess, and at the Docklands, that would be, 10,000? You've still got to get them in and out, and you still don't want them pushing past each other in the rows. I mean, logistically, this is just, it's a nightmare. And fair enough, because we don't want to respread and have a second wave or... So, and you made the very good point just now, it's discretionary. So if it's discretionary, then probably we're all just better off staying at home.
Well, this is a point I wanted to segue to as well. Daniel Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, has obviously become, I guess, infamous for being the him and his government implementing probably the strictest controls.
Except when it comes to the AFL, but that's another story.
Yeah, of course. There's always loopholes. But even like some of his messaging around the relaxation of restrictions isn't like, this is a green light to go forth and do whatever you want. This is, we're relaxing it a bit, we're letting you do a little bit more, but you still have to engage in some common sense around what you're doing and how you go about things, which leads you back to the point, we're really not, I guess, practically unrestricting ourselves, really. It's just more a feeling that we can do a little bit more than what we did before, but we really should just be doing the same thing.
And I kind of feel that should be the dialogue that our governments are having with us, which is we're lifting restrictions, but, and I think they're trying to be fair to them, I think they're trying to have this dialogue, but every time they bring out a regulation, they're destroying the narrative, which is this isn't back to normal and we do need to take care. We're allowing you to go a little bit more about your daily business. What they're really saying, I think, with the restaurant thing is if you're having a birthday, you can have a celebration. It's okay to have a celebration in public. But they're not saying it like that. They're just reading out the regulations, 10 people outdoors in the middle of winter. It's like, I think Australia is a sophisticated enough country, and I think we've proven ourselves over the last 8 weeks as a society that we're willing to do what's required. And we're willing to do it reasonably and to a large extent without the mass hysteria that everyone in the media keeps trying to pile upon this. I think that our leaders really need to sort of develop that dialogue now with the nation and be upfront. If this is going to go on for another 18 months, then we need to know. I mean, I don't know, Ben, how we can ever go back to work normally while there's some distancing.
Yeah. Well, maybe just as a final point, maybe like it's the political discussion in the sense that they're stuck between we got to do like this enforcement of suppressing the virus and taking actions on that front. But then there's like heat being applied by maybe certain segments of the broader society saying this is ridiculous, it's going over the top, when are we reopening, etc. And the only way they can potentially talk their way around that is by introducing rules. So that, because not everyone, you would like to think that everyone would engage in common sense, but there's always that percentage that won't.
Well, yeah, I guess it's maybe you're right. It's hard to know, but I think we've had some people try to claim that these restrictions are something that they're not. They really aren't an impingement on civil liberty, even though there would be some people that would like you to think that. But if they overdo the restrictions as they lift without the right narrative about why we're doing this or where we're headed to, then they run an even greater risk of a backlash down the track. Because the reality is if people aren't mentally prepared, I don't think people will really adapt to this, But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is the new norm and we're already living in it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we might wrap it up there. And I guess a point maybe for future discussions down the track is whether or not this may potentially lead to, I guess, further, not outbreaks, but further detections of more cases in the future, and then what that could mean later down the track.
Well, it's a good question for sure. And I think we'll let it play out and we'll see how it goes. But I think Australia, we're doing okay.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so don't forget our website, scitechculture.com. You can get all of our links and content there. You can subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channels, our RSS feeds, and you can watch us on any and all of your devices. And we appreciate your visit to our website. All right, so that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.